Welcome to my review of Zero Wing for the Genesis. And actually, originally this was only for the Mega Drive in Europe and Japan, I believe. But I do think it got a recent release for the Genesis, a very recent release. Kind of a reproduction. But this is actually quite a good game. It took me about 4 hours to beat. It's one of those very unbalanced games. Now, if you do play this game, the original arcade version of this game, which I'm almost done, I've almost completed it, I'm still working on it. That game is a much more consistent difficulty throughout the entire game. I mean, there are difficulty spikes and unbalanced difficulty in the arcade version, but it's not as severe as this game. So the big thing with this game is the first, I would say, 6 stages are from easy to moderate if you're used to these kind of 16-bit shooters. Now, if you're not, it can still be quite challenging, I'm sure. But I was able to kind of blaze through it until I got to stages 7 and 8. So at that point in stages 7 and 8, the game really spikes up and tries to kind of fuck you over at that point. So it is something to keep in mind. It's a super unbalanced difficulty for this version compared to the arcade version, which maintains a pretty hard game throughout, and then it gets super hard towards the end, obviously. But it has more of a consistent balance throughout the entire game, so you're not getting a huge spike all at once. This game kind of lulls you into a false sense of security where you feel like you're going to just destroy the game. And then you get to stages 7 and 8, and I'm sure a lot of players would hit a brick wall at that point and just shut the game off. So don't be deceived by that. But of course, if you are a pretty persistent, and fairly skilled player of these shooters, you'll probably be able to manage it with enough practice. You just have to learn the routes. As with a lot of old arcade-style games, you got to learn those routes and just kind of hammer it into your brain. You got to just keep dying until you find that perfect route because, the enemies always behave the same in these games. So you're just pathfinding is what these games amount to pretty much. So it's not a matter of twitch reaction. I mean, that does get you through some of the easier sections, and it may get you through some sections, some of the harder sections if you're powered up already. You may be able to twitch react your way through if you can keep your power-ups and skip some hard checkpoints and stuff like that. But for the most part, you're probably going to get stuck on some really fucking hard parts near the end of the game, and you're just going to have to mostly memorize them. You're not really going to be able to brute force them with twitch skill. At least I wasn't able to do so. But there are some good safe spots. Like here you saw I was sitting on the bottom left, and sometimes you can sit on the top left. There's a few safe spots in some boss fights and some areas that you can exploit, which is very useful. And I cover those in the tutorial, which I made a tutorial with commentary, which I'll link in the description. The game has a great soundtrack. As far as the soundtrack goes, it's up there with some of the best as far as shooters go. It's got some real catchy tracks. So when you play the game, you will experience that. There's basically 3 weapon types that you can get. Strangely, you have to collect the red weapon type first to get these pods that go above and below your ship. And what those do is they'll block bullets for you. And you can use them you can run into them with smaller enemies and kill the smaller enemies, but they don't really do anything on large enemies. So there's a safe spot right here on this boss, as you can see, that I found. And this actually works pretty well in the arcade version as well. Some of these safe spots do carry over into the arcade version. But the arcade version is way more wild and difficult overall. And that'll be an interesting one to do a tutorial on. Once I finish that, I got some tough shit that I got to work through near the end. But once I complete that, I will do another review on that and a tutorial for that one as well. So it should be an interesting comparison. So the laser is kind of decently powerful, but sometimes I wonder if it's as powerful as the green homing weapon. But it's kind of hard for me to tell. A lot of times I was using the blue laser a lot during this playthrough, but now that I play the arcade version, I find myself using the homing weapon more often. So I still haven't decided which weapon is more powerful. You would think that the laser weapon would be more powerful, just logically in these games. That's usually how it works. And I still feel like it is. But I heard some opinions to the contrary. At least one opinion that the homing weapon was more powerful. But I don't know if I agree with that. Either way, you'll find what weapons you like for specific scenarios as you play, obviously. That's the whole kind of the whole process of these shooters is just finding the right weapons, finding the right positioning. And that's the kind of game this is, and it's a quality one. It's a good quality. One of the big issues I think is that the game is just not balanced well. It's not balanced as well as the arcade version. Now the arcade version, of course, is still unbalanced with the difficulty, as most arcade games are of this style, but not to the degree of this one. This one, it's like really, really easy compared to the rest of the game. It's real easy to get to like stage 7, pretty much. And then once you get to stage 7, you find yourself in a really bad situation, and it gets worse, But then, of course, the 8th stage is the last stage. The final boss can be very, very cheap as well, which I will show here. I'll show the final checkpoint as well. Now, I'm showing this stage in full right here. This is stage 4. The reason I show this is to illustrate that I beat this stage without a death. I had no deaths on this stage when I first got to it. Now, that's on the Genesis version. The arcade version, I actually died on this stage for a while because the boss is actually tough. The stage isn't too bad in the arcade version, but it's a lot harder than this. And the boss itself is very, very hard in the arcade version. So, big difference there. But that stage is super easy in this version compared. Now, the game starts on the default easy mode. It's easy is actually the default, and it's really, I wouldn't call it easy because it's easy. It's kind of easy until you get to this stage. So this is stage 7, and I'll show some of the highlights of this stage difficulty-wise, but very hard stage. Now, of course, the arcade version is even more wild, if you could picture that. But this is still, pretty damn aggressive. So now this is a checkpoint. You'll see when I respawn right at the checkpoint. Now, when you lose all your lives and continue, you have unlimited continues, and you will start back at the last checkpoint you got to, at least. So you can just sit there and work on the game as long as you need to. Of course, I recommend using an emulator so you can save state practice. And, of course, just save the game when you're done working on it for the day and go back to it. That's what I did. But I don't use save states ever to cheat through a game, but I will use them to practice specific sections. So this is a little mid-boss. Now, this part wasn't one of the hard parts of the stage, but it does show how there's, each stage pretty much has a mid-boss, but I think some of them don't. Like, stage 4 is very short. It only has a main boss, and that's it. But most of the stages seem to have a mid-boss and then a main boss. But the stages are pretty well laid out. I mean, they're interesting. They're fun to fight through. Well done. But it's just not balanced really well as far as, like I said, it's just, really easy, and then you get to the end, and it's really hard all of a sudden. So it's one of those type of games that tries to catch you off guard. It's probably just because it just wasn't ported real accurate to the arcade version. Maybe they were trying to make it easier in a lot of ways because the arcade version is really, really hard. So it's possible they were trying to make it a little easier for the home version, or just maybe that's just how the game came out when they tried to port it. Arcade games tend to be a lot harder than the console versions for whatever reason, I notice. I can understand why that would be the case on the NES, because the NES didn't have the power to put as many bullets and, the speed of the projectiles and all that of the arcade games usually. So that was understandable. But the Genesis was on par with a lot of these 16-bit type of games that they ported. So I don't know why, the arcade versions still tended to be harder than a lot of these home ports. I think it was probably intentional, but it's kind of hard for me to say exactly why the arcade version is so much harder. And remember, that was after I just completed the Genesis version. The arcade version still took me way longer to progress in. So I already had familiarity with the game to some extent, because the layout is similar. But I think the arcade version is just faster, or maybe there's more shit on screen, but it's just harder for whatever reason. But this was already tough by this point. Once you get to stage 7, it starts to get pretty fucking hard. So expect that. I wanted to show this last checkpoint of stage 7 because you have to do this whole area here, and then you have to kill the boss, which the boss is pretty tricky as well. So you see that checkpoint is pretty dense. So you got to get through all that, then you got to kill this boss in one life. So this is a tough part. I had to fight the boss in a very specific way, the way I moved and everything, and I do cover that in the tutorial. But quite a tricky fight. Just the whole checkpoint is pretty hard because, like I said, you got to still beat the boss after going through all that crazy bullet shit. So it's pretty tough. But the arcade version, of course, takes everything up a notch, so that's going to be even more insane. The biggest thing to notice about the difficulty is just the contrast to the rest of the game, because the game is not, it doesn't come off as a hard game until you get to stage 7, then all of a sudden, it's trying to fucking destroy you. So it's very inconsistent with that. So this is the final stage. So you'll see some of what you got to do here. This first checkpoint, very, very hard. One of the hardest checkpoints in the game because you got these homing missiles, constantly coming after you. So you got to constantly be moving up and down for each missile that comes out while you're dealing with all this other shit. So very, very hard checkpoint. Most of the time you die super fast within the checkpoint. So it's very hard. And then after you get past that checkpoint, there's still some hard shit in the stage. But the main thing you're going to be dealing with after that, the hardest part after that is going to be the final boss checkpoint. So if you get past that first checkpoint of stage 8, you should at least be able to get to the final boss. Because that's the hardest checkpoint of the stage aside from the final boss. But yeah, so this is the final checkpoint of the game on the final stage, stage 8. The game is maybe about 40 minutes long if you don't die, based on, my edited run. So, maybe about 40 minutes long. But like I said, this one took me about 4 hours to beat. The arcade version is going to be in a higher range as far as the hours to beat. It's probably going to be over, I would guess over 7 or 8 hours easily. Maybe over 10. I'm not sure yet. I got to see what's coming up, but I'm already stuck on, very hard part. So I'm not sure how long the rest of the game is going to take. This part is actually easy compared to the other checkpoints. I mean, it's just memorizing some of your positions with these bullets that spread out. But you do have to redo this whole tunnel every time you die on the boss. And the boss is very fucking irritating, the final boss that you're about to see. Super irritating. It does some very cheap shit. So, as I covered in my tutorial, the first thing you want to do is take out this laser immediately. This drill laser. So you see me focusing on that first. And while you're doing that, you do have to avoid the homing missiles constantly. So it's very irritating. But once you get in position here, you can kind of catch the homing missiles in your top pod. And you want to keep your top laser going into that top part of the ship that takes damage. But while you're doing that, you need to be getting 2 streams of your laser into those skulls that come out, because those skulls will, if not destroyed fast enough, rush into you and kill you. They home in on your position along with the homing missiles. So very, very difficult. You got to kill those skulls that come out of the ship. And at the end, there's one that comes out that's really, really fucking hard to kill for some reason, and it's real fast. And that one, I died about 7 or 8 times after the boss was leaving, meaning I beat the boss pretty much. See right here where the boss is getting ready to leave? See, now the boss leaves. But see, this skull comes out. And there's going to be one that comes out right near the end. I think it's this one. See how it almost killed me? That one killed me about 8 times at that point in the battle. So I pretty much beat the final boss about 7 or 8 times, and I got fucked over by that last skull. So that's why I say it's really cheap, because the other skulls were not causing that kind of fucking problem. All of a sudden, that one comes out. And I mean, like 7 or 8 times that I got to the end, and it would do that. So that boss took me a while. Because I didn't get that far on the last boss each time I played it. So, it was just the 7 or 8 times that I almost beat it, I got fucked over. But overall, I would give this game a 7 out of 10. I think it's a very solid and a good shooter on the Genesis, though I don't put it up on the top level. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.